Clara Martin stood quietly near the entrance of the large concert hall, holding a worn-out brown satchel in her hand. She looked at the tall building in front of her heart beating faster with every step she took closer. Her shoes were old, but clean, her skirt a little faded, and her gray cardigan had loose threads near the sleeve. She didn't try to hide any of it. She had come with no pretenses, only with a quiet hope in her heart and the weight of her dream. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was buzzing. Young men and women with shiny hair, polished shoes, and expensive instruments were sitting, laughing, talking, and checking their reflections in the tall glass windows. Some were practicing quietly in the corners, their fingers dancing over invisible keys as they rehearsed the notes in their minds. Others were chatting confidently about the pieces they would play, or the music schools they had studied in. The air was thick with talent, ambition, and pride. When Clara walked through the doors, people noticed her immediately. She didn't walk with the same confident steps. She looked older than most of the other contestants, maybe in her late 40s or early 50s. Her face was plain, her hair tied back in a simple bun, and her eyes were tired but kind. She didn't carry herself like someone important or famous. She looked like someone's aunt or maybe a substitute teacher, not a pianist about to audition for a prestigious fellowship. The woman at the registration desk looked at Clara with mild surprise. "Are you here for the audition?" she asked, as if double-checking. Clara nodded and quietly handed over her form. Her voice was soft but clear. "Yes, I'm auditioning for the piano fellowship." The woman blinked and quickly typed her name into the list, then handed her a small number card. "Please take a seat. You'll be called soon." Clara thanked her and moved toward the long row of chairs lined up along the wall. As she walked past the other contestants, a few of them paused, their conversations, to glance at her. A girl whispered something into her friend's ear and covered her mouth to hide a laugh. A young man with shiny hair and a leather music case looked her up and down and shook his head, smirking. Clara noticed all of it, but she didn't react. She had experienced worse. She sat down quietly in the corner and placed her satchel on her lap. Her fingers rested on it gently. Every once in a while they moved in a small rhythm, as if they were tapping out a melody only she could hear. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the noise around her fade into the background. It wasn't the first time people had looked at her like that. All her life, Clara had been underestimated because of how she looked, where she came from, and what she lacked. She didn't have a degree from a famous music school. She didn't have fancy clothes or videos of performances posted online. But she had something else, something she had been carrying quietly in her heart for years, her deep, lifelong connection with the piano. As she waited, her mind drifted to the piano in her small apartment back home. It wasn't perfect. A few keys stuck in the winter, and the pedals creaked. But it was her most cherished possession. She had played it late at night, early in the morning, on good days and bad ones. The music had comforted her when life became too hard. It had been her companion, her secret world, her way of speaking when words didn't work. Now, sitting in a room full of polished strangers who barely gave her a second glance, Clara didn't feel angry. She felt determined. She hadn't traveled all this way to be seen. She had come to be heard. A young woman with perfect curls and expensive boots looked at Clara and asked with a tone that was both curious and slightly amused, "Are you waiting for someone?" Clara looked up and replied, "No, I'm auditioning." The girl blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh, that's great. Best of luck," she said, then turned quickly back to her friend, whispering something that made them both chuckle. Clara returned to her own thoughts. She remembered seeing the poster for this audition months ago at a small library in her neighborhood. It had been tucked in between flyers for guitar lessons and senior yoga classes. "Open auditions, National Piano Fellowship," it read. The words had almost shimmered in front of her. She had torn the poster down gently, folded it neatly, and placed it in her bag. From that moment on, she had begun practicing harder than ever. Every day after work, Clara would come home, make a cup of tea, and sit at the piano. Her fingers weren't as fast as they used to be. Sometimes her hands ached, but the music still flowed through her. Some nights she played until midnight, letting the notes pour out like confessions she could never speak. Her neighbors had once knocked on her door, not to complain, but to ask if she would leave her window open so they could hear better. She had practiced in silence, never posting videos, never sharing recordings. She wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing a feeling she had known since she was a girl, sitting at the church piano in her village, pressing the keys for the first time. Now here she was, surrounded by people who had studied at top conservatories, people who had teachers, with famous last names, people who were half her age and twice as confident. But she didn't compare. She had her own path, and it had brought her here. One of the judges stepped out of the audition room and called a name. A young man stood, fixed his collar, and walked in with a proud smile. As the door shut behind him, more laughter and whispering filled the room. Someone made a joke about his dramatic entrance. Another joked about what piece he was probably going to play. The atmosphere was competitive, but also a little cruel. Clara stayed quiet. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her bag. It was her sheet music, though she didn't need it. She had memorized every note. She looked at the notes like someone might look at an old letter from a loved one, familiar and comforting. Time passed. More names were called. More contestants walked in and out. Some came out smiling, others disappointed. Every time the door opened, Clara's heart jumped a little. She clutched the number in her hand, holding on to it like a lifeline. After a long wait, one of the judges stepped out again and looked at the list. "Clara Martin?" he called. Clara stood up. Her knees felt slightly shaky, but her spine straightened as she took a breath. She picked up her bag, nodded politely to the others, some of whom didn't even look up, and walked toward the audition room. She didn't look like a star. She didn't walk like someone important. But as she reached the door and stepped inside, there was something in her eyes, a quiet flame that had never gone out. The audition room was large and brightly lit. A grand piano stood at the center like a throne. 3 judges sat behind a long table writing notes and looking up briefly as Clara entered. One of them, a woman with glasses and sharp eyes, said, "Name and the piece you'll be performing?" Clara's voice was calm. "Clara Martin. I'll be playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. One of the judges raised his eyebrows. Another looked slightly amused. It was a difficult piece, one that even advanced performers struggled with. Clara didn't explain anything. She walked toward the piano, placed her satchel carefully beside the bench, and sat down. Her hands hovered above the keys for just a moment. Outside the room, the contestants who had laughed at her earlier waited, not expecting anything surprising. But inside, something was about to happen. Something no one in that room would ever forget. Clara Martin's story wasn't the kind that made headlines or filled newspaper pages. It was the kind of story that quietly lived behind closed doors, in the hearts of people who had loved deeply, lost silently, and held on to hope for years without saying much. Long before she sat at that grand piano in the audition room, Clara had lived a life that very few people truly understood. She didn't wear her struggles on her sleeve. She carried them inside, like a melody only she could hear. Clara was born in a small town tucked away between hills and rivers. It wasn't a place where big dreams were common. People there lived simple lives: farmers, shopkeepers, teachers. Her father was a school janitor, and her mother worked in a bakery. Life wasn't easy, but their home was full of laughter and warmth. Her parents believed in hard work, kindness, and the joy of little things. The first time Clara saw a piano, she was 7 years old. It stood in the corner of their small local church, dusty and slightly out of tune. No one played it much, but Clara was drawn to it like a magnet. Every Sunday after service, she would sneak up to it, press a key, and smile at the sound. The pastor noticed her fascination and one day said, "If you're that curious, I'll teach you a little." That kind pastor, who had no formal music training, became her first teacher. He showed her how to sit, how to place her fingers, and how to play simple hymns. Clara picked it up quickly, so quickly that soon she was playing better than he was. Her parents saw the sparkle in her eyes and wanted to help, but they couldn't afford private lessons. So Clara taught herself. She borrowed old music books from the library, listened to classical cassettes from the thrift store, and practiced on the church piano whenever she could. Years passed, and Clara's love for the piano grew stronger. While other children played outside, she stayed back and practiced. Her friends laughed and said she was boring, but she didn't care. The piano gave her something no one else could. It gave her a way to express the feelings she didn't know how to say out loud. By the time she was 16, she was already playing pieces most adults struggled with. Her teachers at school were amazed. One of them even wrote a letter to a music conservatory in the city, hoping to get her a scholarship. And for a brief moment, Clara began to dream. She imagined herself in a big hall, playing for crowds, studying music full-time, maybe even becoming a composer one day. But dreams can be fragile things. Just as she was preparing her application for the conservatory, life took a sharp turn. Her father suddenly fell ill and was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. He couldn't work anymore. Her mother started working longer hours, trying to keep the family afloat. Clara, being the eldest, knew what she had to do. She put away the application and found a job at a local grocery store, then another at a diner on weekends. Her younger siblings needed school uniforms, books, and lunch. The rent had to be paid. The piano dream quietly folded itself into a corner of her heart. For the next several years, Clara's life was all about duty. She helped raise her siblings, cooked meals, and took care of her father. There were times she wanted to scream, times she felt broken, but she never let herself give in. At night, after everyone was asleep, she would take her small keyboard out of the closet and play with headphones on. Those quiet hours became her escape, her way of breathing. Her father passed away when she was 24. By then, her younger brother had dropped out of school, and her sister was expecting a baby. Once again, Clara stepped up. She never complained, not once. She worked 2 jobs and helped take care of the baby while her sister looked for work. No one ever asked her what she wanted, and she never offered to say. People often assumed Clara was shy, even dull. They didn't know how many dreams she had quietly buried under her responsibilities. They didn't see how every note she played was full of stories she could never share. She never told anyone how much it hurt to walk past a music school, to hear a piano in a cafe, or to watch concert videos online. She would smile, nod politely, and then go back to work. She did get her own piano eventually, after saving for 5 years. It wasn't brand new. The keys were slightly yellowed and the wood was scratched, but to Clara it was beautiful. She placed it near the window of her small apartment and played it every evening. Sometimes she cried while playing, and the notes sounded like gentle sobs. Other times she played with joy, and the music filled her home with light. Her neighbors would pause in the hallway listening quietly, not knowing who the pianist was. Over the years, Clara became invisible to the world around her. She was just the woman at the grocery counter, the lady who helped with church events, the person who lived alone and never caused any trouble. But inside, the music never stopped. She kept practicing, learning, playing, and dreaming. Even if the dream had become just a soft whisper. She didn't have social media or a fancy phone. She didn't record her music or post videos. She didn't know how. All she had were old sheet music books, a few handwritten notes, and her deep connection with the instrument. Some days she would close her eyes and imagine herself on a stage, performing under bright lights. The applause in her dream always sounded distant, like something that belonged to another world. Then, one rainy afternoon, while returning from the grocery store, she stopped by the local library. She wasn't planning to stay long, but near the bulletin board, something caught her eye. A yellow paper, slightly crooked, with the words, National Piano Fellowship. Open auditions. All ages. All backgrounds. All are welcome. Clara stood there for a long time, reading and rereading it. The audition was in a different city. She would have to travel, pay for the ticket, and stay overnight. But something in her heart stirred. She tore down the flyer carefully, folded it, and placed it in her worn-out wallet. That night she stared at it for hours. Part of her said it was foolish. She was too old, too unknown, too plain. But another part, the part that still believed in music, whispered, "This is your chance." For weeks she prepared. She chose Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, not because it was easy, but because it spoke to her soul. Every note felt like her own story. The pain, the hope, the struggle. She practiced late into the night, drinking tea to stay awake. She told no one. She didn't want pity or encouragement. She wanted this dream to be hers alone. She sold a few old belongings to buy a bus ticket and booked a cheap hotel for one night. She packed one change of clothes, her music sheets, and a picture of her parents. On the morning of her trip, she stood in front of her mirror and stared at herself. She didn't look like a musician. But then again, music had never cared about looks. As she boarded the bus, the city looked unfamiliar and loud. She held her bag close and kept her eyes on the road. Her heart was full of nerves, but also full of purpose. This wasn't just about an audition. It was about finally doing something for herself, something she had waited for all her life. When she arrived at the concert hall, she felt small among the tall buildings and sharp-dressed people. But she walked in anyway, heart pounding, memories swirling. Every step she took inside was a step, through her own past, through the dusty church piano, the long nights of practice, the sacrifices, the dreams tucked away. She didn't expect applause. She didn't expect anyone to understand. But she was ready. Not because she thought she would win, but because, for once in her life, she had decided to stop waiting. And that decision alone had changed everything. Clara Martin sat in front of the grand piano. Her hands rested gently above the keys, not touching them yet, just floating, waiting. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint buzzing of the lights above. 3 judges sat behind a table across from her. One of them was writing something, another was watching her with mild curiosity, and the third looked bored, tapping a pen on the desk. They didn't seem nervous or impressed. They had seen dozens of performances already that day. Clara, with her plain clothes and tired eyes, was just another name on the list to them. But to Clara, this moment was everything. Her fingers began to move slowly, pressing the first few notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The sound rose in the room like a soft whisper, gentle, unsure, but beautiful. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was delicate, like someone sharing a secret. The judges glanced up, surprised by how emotional the first few bars felt. Clara closed her eyes, just for a second, to connect with the music more deeply. As she continued to play, something began to change. Her body, which had seemed tense a moment ago, relaxed into the bench. Her fingers moved with more confidence, more strength. The notes poured out of her like water flowing from a stream that had been blocked for years and suddenly broke free. Her hands moved quickly, effortlessly, dancing from one end of the keyboard to the other, not with force, but with feeling. Outside the audition room, the other contestants waited. Some were chatting, others checking their phones or listening to music through headphones. No one paid much attention when Clara had walked in. But soon, a sound began to drift through the door. Soft at first, then louder, fuller, richer. It didn't sound like nervous playing. It didn't sound like someone trying to impress. It sounded like someone telling a story. Inside, the judges had all stopped what they were doing. The one who had been bored was now sitting up straight, eyes wide. The woman with glasses leaned forward, listening closely. None of them wrote anything anymore. They just watched. They couldn't take their eyes off Clara. She played with so much feeling that the piano seemed like an extension of her own voice. When the music was soft, it felt like a quiet prayer. When it was loud, it was like thunder rolling through the room. Every rise and fall in the music felt alive. It was like the piano was crying, laughing, whispering all at once. And the story it told was hers. It was a story of a little girl touching a dusty piano in a church. A story of growing up poor but full of dreams. A story of giving up everything for family. Of long nights playing with headphones so no one would hear her cry. A story of holding on to a dream no matter how far away it seemed. Each note carried pain, love, hope, and strength. As the piece continued, her playing grew even more powerful. Her hands moved so quickly, so beautifully, it didn't seem possible that this woman had never trained at a famous school. There was a kind of magic in how she played, a magic you couldn't teach in any classroom. By the time she reached the middle section, where the music becomes soft and emotional again, one of the judges had tears in his eyes. He didn't wipe them away. He just let them fall, as if Clara's music had touched a place inside him that had been closed for a long time. Outside, some contestants began to notice the shift. They stopped talking. One girl stood up and walked closer to the door, trying to hear better. Another whispered, "Who's playing?" Nobody answered. They just stood there listening. Back in the room, Clara reached the final part of the piece. Her face looked calm, almost peaceful. Her fingers, though tired, didn't slow down. They knew the path. They had walked it 1,000 times in silence, in darkness, in hope. Now they walked it proudly, in the light. As she played the last note, the sound floated in the air for a few seconds before fading. She lifted her hands slowly and sat still. Her breathing was steady, her eyes focused. She didn't smile. She didn't look at the judges, as if she didn't expect anything from them. The silence in the room was heavy. No one clapped. It wasn't allowed during auditions, but the energy had changed. The three judges looked at each other, then at Clara. One of them whispered something to another, but no one moved for a few seconds. Finally, the judge with the pen cleared his throat and said, "Thank you, Miss Martin." Clara stood up, nodded politely, and quietly picked up her satchel. She walked out without looking back. As soon as the door opened and she stepped into the hallway, everyone turned to look. The sound of the music still hung in the air, and now they knew who had played it. Some of them stared at her in disbelief. The girl who had laughed at her earlier looked down, embarrassed. The boy with the shiny hair leaned back in his chair, silent. Someone whispered, "She was amazing." Clara didn't react. She walked down the hall slowly, holding her bag close. Her face was calm, but inside, her heart was pounding. She didn't know what the judges had thought. She didn't know if she would be selected. But for the first time in her life, she had played her truth in front of people who had listened. As she reached the exit, an older man in a gray suit walked up to her. He was one of the hall's organizers. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I just wanted to tell you that was unforgettable. I've worked here for 20 years, and I've never heard anyone play like that." Clara smiled softly. "Thank you," she said. He paused, then added, "Where did you study?" "I didn't," she replied. "I just played." He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, as if he understood something deep. "Well, you didn't just play. You spoke, and we all heard you." Clara left the building and stepped into the evening light. The sky was turning golden, and a cool breeze touched her face. She walked slowly down the street, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had come to the city as a quiet, plain woman carrying an old dream. People had laughed, whispered, and judged her before she even touched the piano. But now none of that mattered. The music had spoken louder than their mockery. Later that night, in her hotel room, Clara sat by the window looking out at the city lights. She didn't turn on the TV or check her phone. She just sat quietly, letting the day settle into her heart. She thought about her father, about the church piano, about the years she had spent working while others studied. She thought about all the times she almost gave up, all the nights she had cried in silence. And now, here she was, having done something she never thought she would. She took out her sheet music from her bag and smoothed the pages with her fingers. They were slightly worn, some corners bent, but to her they were gold. That night, she didn't sleep much. She didn't need to. She had already received what she came for, not just a chance, but a moment of truth. She had shown the world what she was made of. The next morning, she got ready early and took the bus back to her town. Nobody on the bus knew what she had done. She looked like any other woman going home after a short trip. But inside, she was different. Something had changed. A part of her that had been sleeping for years had finally woken up. When she reached her apartment, she unlocked the door, placed her bag down, and walked straight to her piano. She didn't even take off her shoes. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. Not for the judges this time, not for the fellowship, but for herself. The room filled with music once again. Music full of life, love, and silent victories. And though she didn't know what the results would be, it didn't matter. Because in that audition room, when her fingers touched the keys, something magical had happened. She had reminded the world that greatness doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it walks in quietly, in simple clothes, with tired eyes and steady hands, and changes everything with just one song. Clara Martin returned to her small town with quiet steps, but her heart was loud with emotion. The sounds of the audition hall still played in her mind, the way her fingers moved over the piano keys, the way the judges stared, the way the room fell into silence when the last note faded. It all felt like a dream, a beautiful dream she never thought she would live. She had gone to the city with hope in her heart and came back with something even stronger, belief in herself. The bus dropped her off near the bakery where her mother once worked. The streets looked the same, old houses, a few bicycles leaning against fences, children playing with sticks and stones. But Clara saw it all differently now. She walked past familiar shops and nodded at familiar faces. Some people smiled, some didn't notice her. No one knew what had happened. To them, she was still the plain woman who lived alone and worked hard. But inside Clara, everything had changed. She opened the door to her small apartment, set her bag down, and walked straight to her piano. She didn't bother changing clothes or even washing her hands. She just sat and started playing. It wasn't the same piece from the audition. It was something she made up, something soft and flowing, like a song to welcome herself home. Her fingers moved with peace, not pressure. She wasn't trying to prove anything now. She was just feeling the music. Days passed, then a week. Clara went back to her regular life, early morning walks, helping at the church, working part-time, shifts. But something inside her had been lit, like a candle that wouldn't go out. She found herself smiling more. She played more. She even started writing her own small compositions, something she hadn't done in years. She didn't tell anyone about the audition. It was her secret, something sacred that she wanted to hold close. One evening, while watering her small balcony, "Plants," she heard her neighbor call her name. "Clara, there's a letter for you. Looks important." She hurried down the stairs, heart pounding a little. The envelope was thick, with a golden seal. The return address was from the National Piano Fellowship Organization. Clara held it with shaking hands. She went back to her apartment, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. Inside was a letter. It read, "Dear Miss Clara Martin, we are honored to inform you that you have been selected as one of the 10 finalists for this year's National Piano Fellowship. Your performance left a lasting impression on all 3 judges. Your deep emotional connection, raw talent, and unique musical voice stood out among hundreds of applicants. We believe the world needs to hear your music. We will be hosting a public performance event in the city next month. All 10 finalists will perform live, and the top 3 will receive recording opportunities, concert tours, and scholarships for advanced musical training. Travel and accommodation will be provided. We look forward to hearing you again." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She read the letter again and again, not believing it at first. A finalist, out of hundreds, her. A woman with no formal training, no teacher, no professional recordings. The plain woman they had once laughed at was now among the top 10. She held the letter close to her heart, as if afraid it might disappear. She walked over to her piano and sat down, but she didn't play. She just rested her hands on the keys and let the moment settle. It wasn't just about making it to the finals. It was about being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Over the next few days, things began to shift. She received phone calls from the fellowship team. They asked about her preferences for food, accommodation, travel plans. They offered to send a piano technician to tune her instrument if she needed one. They even asked if she wanted help selecting a new piece to play for the final performance. Clara thanked them kindly but told them she already had something in mind. She had started working on a piece of her own, a soft, emotional melody she had begun writing years ago but never finished. Now, with this opportunity, she knew it was time. The piece wasn't flashy. It didn't have fast scales or loud crescendos. It was simple, but full of feeling, just like her. As the final performance date drew closer, Clara practiced day and night, not out of fear or pressure, but because she loved it. Every time she sat at the piano, she felt alive. She imagined the audience listening, feeling what she felt. She thought about all the people who had forgotten their dreams, who felt invisible, who thought they were too old or too plain. She wanted to play for them, to remind them that it was never too late. When the day of the final event arrived, Clara traveled back to the city. This time, she was not a nameless face. She was expected. Her name was on the program list. A young woman with a clipboard greeted her at the hotel, handed her a welcome bag, and said, "We're so excited to have you here, Miss Martin." Clara thanked her with a smile. She looked around at the other finalists in the lobby. Most were young, dressed in stylish clothes, talking about their conservatories, their teachers, their tours. Clara stood quietly to the side, wearing a simple blouse and long skirt, holding her music folder close to her chest. Some of them looked at her curiously. One of the girls whispered, "Is that the woman from the first audition?" Another said, "Yeah, she was incredible. Came out of nowhere." They didn't laugh this time. There was no mockery in their voices, just surprise and a little awe. The next evening, the concert hall was full. Hundreds of people filled the seats: musicians, critics, music lovers, and families. A few talent scouts were in the front row, ready to discover the next big star. The air buzzed with energy and excitement. Backstage, Clara sat alone on a bench, eyes closed, breathing slowly. One by one, the finalists went on stage. Some played with fire, some with grace. The audience clapped, cheered, admired. Clara listened quietly, her hands folded on her lap. When her name was finally called, Clara Martin, performing an original composition. She stood up, straightened her skirt, and walked toward the stage. The lights were bright. The piano stood under a soft spotlight. She walked across the wooden floor, her shoes making soft tapping sounds. When she reached the piano, she turned to face the audience and gave a small nod. Then she sat down. She didn't rush. She took a deep breath and placed her hands gently on the keys. For a moment she let the silence speak. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, like raindrops on a window. Slowly the melody grew, rising like the sun after a storm. It was simple, honest, and pure. No dramatic movements, no forced emotion. Just Clara, telling her story through sound. People leaned forward in their seats. The room grew still. Her music spoke of longing, of sacrifice, of quiet courage. It wrapped itself around every listener, like a warm blanket. Even those who didn't understand music technically felt something. It was the kind of performance that made you forget where you were, that pulled you into someone else's soul for a while. As the final notes echoed through the hall, Clara let her hands rest. She didn't bow right away. She looked out at the audience, eyes glistening, heart full. Then she stood up and gave a simple bow. The silence broke into thunderous applause. People stood up. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. Even the judges were applauding, something they rarely did during a competition. One woman in the audience whispered, "I don't know who she is, but that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Clara walked off stage quietly, but this time she felt tall. The other finalists greeted her with respect. The girl who had once looked down on her came up and said, "That was powerful. I've never felt anything like that before." Later that night, the winners were announced. Clara didn't come first. She didn't need to. The judges awarded her the special jury prize, an invitation to record her own album and perform at a European music festival. But more than that, she had won something no trophy could match: the love of the audience, the respect of her peers, and the peace of knowing she had finally been heard. Back in her hotel room, Clara placed the certificate and envelope on the table and sat by the window. The city lights sparkled below. She thought of her parents, the church piano, the long nights, the hard years. And she smiled. She didn't know where this new path would take her. But one thing was clear. The world had finally seen what she had always known deep down. That music didn't care about looks, age, or fame. It only cared about truth. And Clara Martin had told the truth in every single note. Clara Martin sat on the train as it moved through the countryside, trees flashing past the window like a painting in motion. The train was taking her to the next chapter of her life, a music festival in Europe where she would perform in front of a large international audience. It felt surreal. Just months ago, she was playing alone in her little apartment, thinking her dreams had passed her by. Now the world was listening. She held a small notebook in her lap, filled with handwritten music. Her original composition, the one that had moved an entire concert hall to tears, was now going to be recorded professionally. She had been invited to collaborate with experienced musicians and producers. They didn't care that she hadn't gone to a fancy school or trained under a famous teacher. They only cared about what they heard when she touched the piano. As the train rolled into the city where the festival would take place, Clara looked out at the streets, the buildings, the people walking quickly with instruments on their backs and music in their hands. She was both nervous and excited. Everything was new. The language, the place, the faces. But the one thing that felt familiar was music. It was the only language she had always spoken fluently. She was welcomed at the festival with kindness and respect. A young assistant named Eric helped her check into her hotel, showed her the schedule, and explained how rehearsals would work. "You're our special guest," he said with a warm smile. "Everyone is looking forward to hearing you play." Clara smiled back, still surprised that anyone thought of her as special. That evening, she entered the grand concert hall for the first time. It was huge, with tall ceilings, red velvet curtains, golden lights, and rows of seats. She had never seen anything so beautiful. She walked slowly to the stage where a grand piano waited, shining under soft lights. She touched the keys gently just to feel them. Then she sat down and began to play. Not for an audience, not for judges, just for herself, letting the sound fill the empty hall. She played the same melody she had played in the competition, but this time it sounded different. Bigger, fuller, more confident. Like a voice that had once been quiet was now singing freely. The next few days were busy with rehearsals, sound checks, interviews, and meetings. Clara met musicians from all over the world. Young pianists, composers, violinists, and singers. Some were impressed by her story, others were curious. A few even admitted they had watched a video clip of her audition online, which had gone viral quietly. "You reminded us that music is about feeling," one girl from Spain told her. "Not just technique." Clara was still the same woman in simple clothes, with her hair tied back and her notebook in her hand. She didn't try to change her style or copy others. She smiled softly, listened more than she spoke, and practiced quietly in corners when the hall was free. But wherever she went, people began to notice her calm presence and the deep emotion in her music. On the day of her performance, the concert hall was packed. People from different countries had come to see the lineup of artists. Clara was scheduled to perform in the second half. As she sat backstage, she could hear the audience cheering for the performers before her. Some played fast, exciting pieces. Others sang with powerful voices. Clara didn't compare herself to them. She just sat still, her hands resting on her lap, breathing slowly. When her name was called, she stood up and walked to the stage. The applause welcomed her gently. She bowed, then sat down at the piano. The hall went quiet. She began to play. The notes flowed softly at first, like the beginning of a story. Her fingers moved smoothly, telling of memories, struggles, and small victories. The music rose and fell like a wave, carrying the audience with her. Some closed their eyes to feel the emotion better. Others sat still, listening deeply. This time Clara wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid of judgment or comparison. She had already proved what she needed to prove, to herself. Now she just wanted to share. Her music spoke of love, loss, and hope, of time passing and dreams returning. Every note was honest. Every pause had meaning. As she reached the final part of her piece, the music grew softer, more peaceful. It was like a sunset, a gentle ending after a long journey. When she played the last note, it hung in the air for a moment before fading, then silence, and then applause. But this applause was different. It started slowly, then grew into a thunder of claps, cheers, and standing ovations. Clara stood and bowed, her eyes slightly wet. She had touched the hearts of strangers across the world. She had told her story through music, and they had understood. After the performance, people came to speak with her. Musicians, students, teachers, and audience members all thanked her. Some said they had been moved to tears. Others asked how she wrote such emotional music. A young boy gave her a drawing he had made during her performance, a picture of a woman, at a piano surrounded by stars. Later that night, back in her hotel room, Clara looked at the drawing and smiled. She placed it in her notebook beside her music. She opened her window and let the cool night air in. The city lights sparkled below, and the soft hum of life surrounded her. She thought about how far she had come, from a child touching dusty piano, keys in a church, to working jobs that left her tired, to practicing in secret, to playing on one of the world's biggest stages. It hadn't been easy. There were years of silence, years of doubt. But somehow she had held on to the tiny flame of her dream. And now it was burning bright. In the days that followed, Clara stayed in Europe for a while. She recorded her music in a studio with a team of kind, talented people who treated her with respect. She visited small concert halls and shared her music with different audiences. Every performance brought new faces, new smiles, new connections. She didn't try to become famous. She just wanted to play and let people feel something real. Back home, news of Clara's success had reached her town. Articles appeared in local newspapers. The video of her first audition had been watched by millions. People who once ignored her now spoke her name with pride. Neighbors congratulated her. Old classmates sent messages saying they were inspired. Even the church where she first touched a piano held a small event in her honor. Children played short songs, and Clara was invited to speak. She stood in front of them, humble as ever, and said, "Don't let the world decide your worth." Sometimes, the quietest voice has the most powerful message. Her words stayed with them. Months passed. Clara returned to her peaceful apartment, but her life was no longer small. She received invitations to perform in schools, churches, smalls, theaters, and even big events. She said yes to most of them, not for fame, but to share her gift. People listened, people felt, and people remembered. She also began teaching. A few students came to her home nervous and shy. Clara didn't just teach them scales and chords. She taught them to feel, to express, to believe. She told them stories about music, about life, about dreams that wait patiently in our hearts. Her students grew confident, not just as players, but as people. Years later, Clara was still playing, still teaching, still living simply. But she was no longer the woman who thought she had missed her chance. She had created a path of her own, carved from honesty, love, and perseverance. Sometimes, she would walk to the same bench outside the church where she first dreamed of becoming a pianist. She would sit quietly and listen to the wind. And in that silence, she would hear the music of her life. People often said, "Clara Martin is a reminder that true beauty isn't loud. It doesn't wear fancy clothes or shout for attention. It walks softly, speaks gently, and touches the heart." Her story became one told in classrooms, music schools, and family dinners. Not because she won trophies, but because she stayed true to herself. And whenever someone felt too old, too plain, or too late to follow a dream, someone would say, "Remember Clara Martin." They mocked her at the piano audition, but then they froze when she performed, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. And that, in the end, made all the difference.